Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co, and today I'm reviewing Tidal Blades Rise of the Enfolders from Druid City Games. And Tidal Blades Rise of the Enfolders is a campaign-based dungeon crawling experience set in the world of Tidal Blades, first set forth in the, original game Tidal Blades, which is a totally different genre, not a dungeon crawler, totally different experience, but set in the same world, the same universe, carrying over the same story and characters. And this, by the way, everything you see here is a prototype. This is a dive into a prototype experience, 6 missions out of however many there are in the actual campaign and the final game and all of that, but rules, components, all that stuff subject to change. And this, by the way, link to the Kickstarter down below. You can check that out as well, but let's go ahead and dive into this. So, Tidal Blades Rise of the Enfolders, a dungeon crawling experience that in some ways differentiates itself from the dungeon crawling universe, and it's the dungeon crawling genre, really, and in other ways is basically more of the same, more of the stuff you're used to. And it's going to have some of those common elements in the sense that you have a map, a grid. You may not be able to see these lines properly, but there are little hexes on the board as you wander around from zone to zone to basically take out the variety of enemies that are either on the board or potentially spawning on the board. Different scenarios or different campaigns, missions will have different rules attached to them. Along the way, you're going to be picking up the various goodies they drop when they die. You're going to be picking up the various fruit as you wander around, and you're going to be trying to accomplish your scenario goals. Your scenario goals that are all listed in this handy-dandy storybook that will give you, the quests, the setup adjustments to player count, things like that, the steps as you go through it, because there are steps. There's going to be sequential steps of things happening as you hit one story beat or the next story beat, no different than a door opening or things, happening. And in this case, that's going to be through this use of unfolding books. You're going to have these books that open up and unfold, this dome that as you get closer to it, you can go ahead and tuck it beneath, and suddenly you have a whole different board setup without having to do anything with tiles or setup or all these other complicated stuff. And yes, there are more than 2 books. There's at least 3. I don't know what the final game will have, but we have at least 3 over here as far as setting up more complicated scenarios, complicated setups for the game. But that's the general dungeon crawling aspects. And then you have stats, you have attacking, you have other things like that, you have movement, stuff to manage around as you go. Past that, you're going to have the unique little card row that is where Tidal Blades stands out. It's where Tidal Blades differentiate itself from other dungeon crawling experiences. You see, every single round you're going to have 4 cards into your hand, and you're going to pick your card, and you're going to set it down into your initiative, prepping for the round at play. And maybe I go ahead and pick this one over here. I'll just go ahead and pick this one. It's a simple enough card, it works for me, and I'll slot it down into my initiative. The other players all do the same, and then when we're ready, we go ahead and reveal the card, and I'm going to be modifying my initiative downwards by 1. So I'm moving down on the initiative track, which is going to be the turn order in relation to the other players, and it's a cooperative experience, as well as in relation to the various baddies, the various monsters that you're fighting against. You're going to lock that in, and then once you're all done, you'll also reveal the monsters. You're going to check out the monsters cards, and oh look, the spine squids are going to go down 2 as well. So again, the bad guys, the good guys, they're all adjusting the difficulty track in different ways to decide the turn order of the round. From there, in turn order structure, let's go ahead and grab a card for her over here, for Dust. We're going to grab a card for Dust, and let's put that in play. And then Dust is going to slot her cards somewhere into her row. You see, you have this 3x3 grid in which you'll be placing cards in order to take actions. And this grid's important because whenever you place a card, you get to activate the full row or column that you place the card in. Now, the board does come with pre-printed stuff on it, so no matter what you do, you're always getting 3 goodies. The card you placed, and then 2 others depending on the row, the column, whatever else is on the board. Things that are printed on the board, things that are printed on the card, or perhaps even bad things as the various enemies attack you and inflict conditions that go on your cards, polluting your ability to take a clean, efficient action in the game. Once you place your card, you'll go ahead and activate that row or column, and then if the card row or column is filled, you'll discard that row or column, which leads to a bit of a puzzle as far as how you build out your board, as far as how you take those actions that will be as powerful as possible, while also being mindful of taking multiple strong actions instead of a single strong action, so you kind of want to leave your board prepped for the next action, but eventually have to clear it. Things like that are all going to go through your mind as you try to puzzle out the most efficient way to tackle the puzzle in front of you, the enemies in front of you. You see, you're going to have to be managing how you move across the board. You're going to have to be managing your defense, slotting in defense tokens in order to prepare for the enemies that will attack you. You have to be prepared to chain your attacks together with a bunch of other attacks in order to roll giant handfuls of dice against the enemies, hopefully taking them out, but being mindful of things like positioning and, whether you have advantage or disadvantage in the attack. Are you ganging up with other enemies? Are you taking a ranged attack when you're too close? These things, these modifiers will affect how you roll your dice. And then you want to be mindful of your resources in the game, your spirit and your focus, your spirit and your synergy, spirit and focus, I did it right the first time, your spirit and your focus as you spend your spirit to move around the board, as you spend your focus to re-roll dice or to do different things to basically modulate or manage the luck aspects of the game, or to manage the weaknesses you have from not being able to slot the right cards into your row as you go. Now this is, like I said already, a campaign-based experience, which means across the course of play, you will be adding various things to your deck. You'll be building out this deck so that, yes, every round you have your hand of cards, every round you're placing a card down, but controlling for what's in your deck is something you can do as you play through the game. You see, you're going to have your little character sheets over here that you'll be, and I don't know what they look like in the final game. These are function just fine, but I don't know if they're any different or however they're going to be. But you're going to have different things as you mark your wounds, as you mark your experience, your fruit, as you slowly unlock different things as far as earning extra upgrades, earning extra unlocks, weeding your deck, both adding and taking away things from your deck in order to ensure the best cards that come out and work for you. And some of those cards are going to have powers on them as well. You're going to have cards that go into your board and give you persistent powers, powers that are in play regardless of whether you activated that row or column, and giving you something else to manage. So as you add these power cards to your deck, you're inherently improving your strength on the board, which is important because you're eventually going to start fighting bosses. Across the course of the game, you're fighting a whole bunch of enemies that pop out both in the setup and sometimes enemies that spawn across the course of the round, but you're going to be managing those enemies on this track, and every round they play their own card, and so you have some idea of the types of enemies that you can expect and how they act. These enemies are fast, those enemies have armor, these enemies will inflict various conditions on you. So all the enemies have some degree of predictability around the general way they operate, while the actual card you flip every round is going to determine their initiative, how they attack, the ranged attack, not ranged attack, what other things they do, whether they spawn new minions as well. A whole bunch of stuff are happening on those cards, and then you're going to go through that, dealing with the enemies, dealing with the stronger enemies as you have those, and eventually dealing with bosses as well. Bosses that have a whole different activation system in terms of being significantly stronger and significantly more out to get you across the course of the game. Past that, you're going to be going through the missions, going through the campaign, leveling up, trying to accomplish certain feats as you go through it. Every single round, your characters are going to be dealt these cards that give you different feats to achieve, things that you want to be mindful of so you can basically upgrade across the course of the game. Sure, you can win the scenario, but did you manage to inflict 5 damage in a single shot? Did you manage to dash across the board and 5 movement twice in the scenario? These things are going to be small feats that add to your ability to slowly level up and progress throughout the course of the campaign. And it's a campaign that will give you degrees of consequences to the way things played out. It has fail forward. It has fail forward in the sense that you're going to always be moving forward in the game, but what happens when you fail is going to determine the outcome of the other things, the outcome of future enemies. The composition of various enemy decks might adjust or change depending on how well you did in one scenario or the next. The amount of experience you gain, the different types of things that will happen will have some degree, not necessarily a huge degree, but some degree of consequence as you carry over from one mission to the next, going through the Tidal Blades experience. And that's kind of where I am with this so far. Like I said already, I'm a variety missions deep. I've played this game. The prototype has 6 campaign missions. I've played the game more than 6 times, but there are 6 campaign missions, 6 campaigns you can go through, 6 scenarios you can go through. But the final game will have significantly more when you dive into it. But that, in a fairly decent nutshell, is Tidal Blades. A few other small things, such as wounds. As you take wounds into the game, as you take damage, you're going to slowly move down this track, adding wounds to your board, wounds that will clog your board over here, and eventually, if you take enough of them, you're going to be adding different cards. You're going to be getting these battle scar cards that will go into your deck as well. And so you want to be modifying around those as well at the same time, because the enemies, when they attack you and inflict conditions, those conditions will go onto your board, and those will affect the row or column you activate when you have those. Your wounds and your battle scars will also get in the way, trying to basically provide a new aspect to the puzzle as you try to figure out how to have as an efficient turn as possible, but also understanding that there's a wound clogging up your board, there's a battle scar clogging up your board, there's different things that get in the way of the perfect optimization, and that, I think, for the second time, is Tidal Blades. Which brings us to the review part of things, going over the general, where I am with this game, the ease of play, player count, like, don't like, all that stuff. Starting off with ease of play. And the rules are prototype here, so I won't heavily comment on those. I will say they were not the best rules, but that's also because they're in a ward format. So no real ding against them. It's a prototype rule set, but it was fairly easy game to understand for the most part, just with, caveat with prototype rules. As far as teaching the game is a breeze to teach. this is a fairly easy game to get people up and running on. I would say with the caveat that I've only taught this to people who've played other dungeon crawlers, so factor that into my opinion of how easy a game it is to teach. But especially because it's a cooperative game, and especially because it shares some common beats with dungeon crawlers, you can get people up and running fairly quickly and then start guiding them through things as they go, saying, okay, great, you're going to be playing a card into a row and column, you're going to be doing this, that, and this, and slowly teach them the various nuances of how different things happen, of how your shells will move over every round if you don't actually take damage. If you don't use them to defend yourself, they'll be moving over into your quantum reservoir, potentially powering new abilities. There's small nuances and things you'll need to teach people, but for the most part, you can get people up and running genuinely within 5 or 10 minutes of rules. Will get someone up and running in this game. So it's an easy game to teach. As far as other aspects of ease of play, the setup and tear down and campaign play, those are things that are definite, well, things that are victim to campaign play in general. Campaign games, which have a degree of tracking things in between games, always have that additional barrier of putting things away more precisely, putting things away, managing the changes to the sequence, making sure your cards are adjusted, and this will have all of those factors as well, both the setup, the tear down, and managing your campaign between games. All the pros and cons of a campaign game are here in terms of that accessibility, in terms of diving into it again and again and again. As far as player count, this is a 1 to 4 player game. I have played this one so far at 2 and 3 players. I specifically have not played it solo because currently in this prototype they haven't yet done true solo. My understanding is that they will have true solo for the game, so if you're interested in that, you can dive into that. I just haven't done true solo yet because it's not yet here. And as far as a 4 player game, based on playing it so far, I would say 2 and 3 players were both great, both very accessible. I'd be willing to play at 4 players, but at that point I'd probably prefer a lower player count. 3 players had a slightly more party feel as we worked together, and 2 players had a slightly getting more done each as opposed to taking turns waiting for the 3rd player. So 2 and 3 are likely my favorite, with the caveat that those are the only 2 player counts that I've played it at so far. As far as like, don't like, and can see others not liking, the art and rule to begin with, and I believe this is the art of Mr. Cuddington if I'm not mistaken, the art and rule building of Mr. Cuddington. And yes, that is definitely, I mean, it's a gorgeous game. From the miniatures, and I don't know if there's a standee version or not. There in the prototype we have both standees and miniatures. I don't know what the Kickstarter itself will have, but the miniatures, the standees, the art, the pages, flipping over these pages, flipping over your books as you go from one scenario to the next, as you slowly adjust for the various things that are happening as you move these, as you flip these boards. It gives you a degree of having the game, the scenario change around you without having to deal with a ton of tiles, without having to deal with a ton of setup and tear down. While this does have some typical campaign games, aspects to the setup and tear down, a lot of other aspects are very streamlined in terms of how easy it is to actually dive into this game, how easy it is to actually take your turn, to play your moves. The turns are fast paced. This is not a game where you're min-maxing your move for half an hour trying to figure out the exact optimal card to play. There's a degree of playing your card, and also you might have an intent. You might have an intent to play this card over here, but based on how the initiative track changes, based on how the enemies are approaching you and what your allies do in the game, you might change where you play your card. So there's a degree of not really committing what you did, which gives you that flexibility you might want. And there's enough things going on in the game that it gives you a large degree of agency to playing out your moves on the player board. And this player board is easily my favorite part of the game. This is a system that I've seen before in Monumental, and it's a system I loved in Monumental. It's done differently here, but the idea of activating full rows and columns and then clearing them out is always a lot of fun to me, and that remains true in Tidal Blades. It remains true as I place cards down, being mindful not just of the move that I'm taking at the moment, being mindful of the move that I'm taking 2 turns from now, 3 turns from now. Do I want to activate a row next? Do I want to activate a column next? Do I want to leave myself open for either option, whichever is going to be better for me at the time? And so there's a large degree of fun as you make your board more powerful. Now, that does come with ebbs and flows. That does come with the idea that your board will slowly clear as you go through the game, so you want to be mindful of that too. And sometimes there's also that trade-off of taking a particularly powerful action, of taking a 3-card action, understanding that it might clear your board earlier than you planned on, but it might still be the best result for you, given the enemies in your face, given the boss who's charging across the room. There are different things to be mindful of as you go through it, and so the characters have that degree of power and abilities of building out your board, of building out your deck too. Because of the fact that this is a campaign game, because of the fact that this gives you those multiple plays to modulate how your character is built, you'll start off with a character that has some degree of differences in terms of how the characters are. I haven't played as all the characters. I believe there are 4 in this prototype. I haven't played as all of them yet. I've only played as 2 of them myself, but they do have differences in the way the characters feel, but you're going to have the characters growing and developing as you dive into the experience. You're going to be adding cards to the deck. You're going to be removing cards to the deck. You're going to be slightly adjusting and customizing their playstyle to suit the way you want want to build out that character. And so between the strengths, the nuances, the powers, all of that, the progression the game gives you, there's a lot of fun and a lot of reward as you build out your deck and then play it onto this board and do the things that you created and guided your character in order to be. And the missions offer you different challenges and experiences every single time. Again, I've only played 6 scenarios so far, and while some are more similar than others, I would say there were enough differences, enough uniqueness to the scenarios that for the most part, you're getting a fairly different experience every time. The bosses are definitely their own complete different game as far as the boss challenges that they offer, and then even without the bosses, you have, again, some degree of similarity. At the end of the day, every one of these is going to have a bunch of tiles, a bunch of enemies, and you're charging through trying to take them out. But then past that, there are nuances. There's going to be, trying to get to one location on the board and then slowly shutting down a portal. There's going to be general progression as you wander through, as you save various captives. There's going to be jumping around from rocks in the sky to rocks in the sky. There's going to be trying to deal damage to these various flying robots. There's going to be all these different small nuances that change up the experiences you had. Again, I can't speak for the full game, but I will say there was enough variety in the prototypes that I had that it felt like playing a different game. Not a different game. It felt different enough in each scenario that I enjoy the variety they brought to the table. And then the bosses are creative and feel challenging at the same time. The bosses have this kind of degree of stompiness to them as far as the way they're going to maraud across the board, as the way they're going to basically attack you no matter what you do. And I've only faced off 2 bosses, again, prototype. But those bosses both are going to hunt you down, try to kill you, try to attack you as much as possible, and you have to figure out how to survive them as much as possible. Because as much as possible is the key word here. The bosses ultimately will do damage to you. That's not the question. The question is, can you mitigate the amount of damage they do? Can you hopefully stop them from being overly aggressive? Because the bosses also tend to be fairly annoying if they don't hit you. One of the ways, again, bosses could be changed in terms of the final game or different bosses, but the ones we faced off against, they seem to want to kill you and stomp you, but they also seem to want to do things that are potentially even worse if they don't kill you and stomp you, which leads to this situation where you find yourself sometimes offering your character up as bait, trying to prep yourself, prep your shields, prep your health as much as possible along the way, because, well, if you're going to be bait, you might as well be good bait in this game. And so the bosses do provide that extra degree of challenge and difficulty as far as the way they add to the game. As far as things I don't like, the biggest thing I have, and I just mentioned the difficulty, I didn't know that, but the biggest thing I had is past the bosses, I don't feel the game felt difficult enough yet. I say yet with a giant caveat because for the most part, again, the bosses did offer a degree of challenge while still being beaten for the most part, but then past that, the individual scenarios, while you are definitely trying to optimize every single round, I did find the scenarios easy enough to go through as far as staying alive, as far as getting only a wound or two, as far as taking out the enemies. For the most part, bosses aside, I rarely felt threatened for my life. I felt like I was playing the game strategically, going through the puzzle, but I definitely want a higher sense of danger to the game. Now, I have spoken to Druid City Games, I have spoken to him already about this, and I know that they do have plans to add in difficulty modulation stuff to the game. I don't know their exact approach or how they plan on doing that, but I know that this is something they're aware of and something that they are adding. They've had different experiences. Some people seem to stomp through the game, some people have a harder time or an easier time, and so they are adding that degree of adjustable difficulty in order to make sure that you have the difficulty experience that you're looking for. But that's really my biggest complaint. My biggest complaints against Tidal Blades was while I very much enjoyed the experience, while I very much enjoyed the full package that this game is offering, from the beauty, from the art, from the presentation, from the strategy, from the player boards, all those things, I do want the game to be, well, slightly more of a challenge, so I actually feel the threat of death as I play through it. Again, bosses aside, the bosses were slightly more annoying. Past that, a few other small things. First of all, this game does have the typical negatives that I have with campaign games. I say I have because it's just a question of what you're looking for. For myself, campaign games are always an additional challenge to get through, and this does have that. This does have that aspect of the setup, the tear down, the remembering what you were doing, the pulling out the cards and trying to figure out whether your character was properly, where your character is at this time. Did you properly track all their stuff? Did you add the cards to the deck? And so, again, this is ultimately a decision for you, but if you find campaign games aren't for you, while I do think Tidal Blades is more accessible than many campaign games I've played, it's still at the end of the day a campaign game, and so factor that in. And then lastly, I would say that it's I want the characters to feel even more different than they currently do. Meaning, I did mention the characters do feel different, and it's definitely true. It's not something quite like having a character pop and teleport across the board that reminds you that that character is different than the other characters. But I want the characters to feel even more different. I want there to be even more nuance to the characters, because for right now, I would say that some cards make them stand out as being slightly different, but then a lot of other cards have a lot of overlap, a lot of similarity, and I want the characters to really completely feel like their own dedicated characters. Again, there is difference, to be very clear, but I want to feel like I'm playing almost a full different class as opposed to having a few cards that make that character stand out. As far as things you might not like, as far as things I can see others not liking, this game has a lot of dice rolling. This game has a lot of dice rolling. You're going to be rolling dice all the time to see if you can attack, and the dice may or may not be in your favor, and you do have to factor that in. Now, you do have focus, you do have mitigation, you have the opportunity to spend shells from your Quantum Reservoir to go for a reroll, so there is mitigation across the course of the game, which is why it doesn't particularly bother me, but you're rolling a lot of dice. The enemy are going to be rolling their own dice every turn as they attack, which again offers that's a high degree of variance, as they have a double attack or a double negate over there. That's a huge shift. That's a 4-hit swing, which can be a lot as you try to stay alive in this game. So there's definitely luck with mitigation, but there is definitely luck in the game. And then wounds and things will clog your board. As you get wounded, as you take hits, you're going to find your board starts getting clogged up, which you might find frustrating. It limits your ability to be as efficient as you like. Now, speaking for myself, based on at least where the difficulty is so far, I was fine with it in the sense that it gave you an additional challenge to be mindful of. Having a wound on your board, clogging up your board, just gives you one more thing to puzzle out as you figure out how to optimally place your cards. That said, that's true for having a wound or 2 on your board. I can't speak for having 7 wounds on your board or how that would play out, so there definitely is a factor as far as seeing how much difficulty is equated with less fun. In general, I do tend to be fairly wary of when difficulty scaling is just means less fun. This game can have that. It hasn't yet been my experience, but it's certainly something I'm mindful of. And then lastly, replayability. At the end of the day, because it's a campaign game, because it's scenario driven, it's something that you might want to be mindful of, that replaying the game is going to be less fun the second time round. Not fun, not at all. In fact, like I said already, I've already played some of these missions more than once as I went through this, and it still was fun the second time, but it certainly was less fun. That sense of exploration, that sense of what happens next, that sense of what's going to happen when we hit that first story point. We're going to flip over a new tile, we're going to spawn new enemies, we're going to have this new challenge come our way, that boss is now charging towards us. Like, finding out how things happen in this game, playing through it a second time will take away a little bit from that experience. I still think it does have replayability. I don't think it's a one-shot game, and for myself, if I play through this entire campaign, that's already a win. I don't need it to be replayable, but it's something worth mentioning as far as what you're looking for in a dungeon crawler. This game will be fun the second time round, but I certainly think that you lose some of the sense of exploration, some of the sense of adventure that second or third time around. As far as final thoughts for this game, I really like Tidal Blades. I really liked it a lot, and it wasn't a game that I was expecting much from, probably because I just didn't know much about it. At the end of the day, I find that dungeon crawlers, there are more and more of them every single year, and it becomes to a certain extent harder to stand out in this genre, because there's only so many ways you can maraud through a dungeon, there's only so many ways you can parade across the board, swinging your sword, taking down enemies before they start to blend into one another. And to a certain extent, it does have some of that as far as marauding across the board and swinging your sword and smashing down enemies, but Tidal Blades manages to stand out in a few ways. It stands out, first of all, in the way this card row works. I've seen this general strategy done in other games. I haven't yet seen it implemented in a dungeon crawler, and I like the implementation. I like that building up of the character and the trying to build out your board and planning around things that this game gives you, and that as the core action mechanism simultaneously manages to be strategic, rewarding, engaging, but also light and accessible enough that it doesn't have the mental weight that sometimes a game like Gloomhaven can have. Gloomhaven's a fantastic game, I'm not dinging it, but it's sometimes that there's a lot more energy behind playing Gloomhaven, and Tidal Blades manages to give me the strategy while remaining accessible at the same time. Then you combine that with the sheer beauty of this game, the art of Mr. Cuddington, the production quality of Druid City Games, and between those two you have something that manages to stand out in a crowded space, something that manages to be fun and engaging. And I love these player boards. It's something that Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion did very successfully, and I like seeing it implemented here. The idea of having just everything done on books, so you have less setup, less tear down, less work in terms of going into and playing the game, and then combine that with these tiles, these boards just flipping around, providing, depending on the scenario, sometimes you'll have like 3 or 4 different flips in the game, as I try to flip this back now, but yeah, you'll have sometimes 3 or 4 different flips in the game, unlocking one story beat after another, which is a lot of fun. It gives you that unveiling sense of exploration and adventure without any of the tediousness you sometimes have from tile-based games as you open up a new room, as you place down new tiles, as you set up everything else in the game. Overall, Tidal Blades is a great balance of accessibility and engaging and strategy that I'm just having a ton of fun going through it. Like I said already, this is a game that only has 6 missions, and I've already played it, I think, 8 times as far as diving into the different options, replaying a scenario or two, and just having a lot of fun exploring what this has to offer so far. I do have slight concerns about the campaign play. Is it a game that I end up playing? And I think it is. The games come in at generally around an hour apiece, and it's not that overbearing compared to other campaign games that I do want to go through it all. I do want to build out my character. I do want to see where the world grows. My biggest concern is what I mentioned already, is the difficulty. The difficulty is something that I need to see it ramped up. I need to feel like in all the missions I could die. I don't actually care about dying. Dying never bothers me, and this game does have fail forward, which is something I love. I'm never going to repeat the same scenario just because I died. It'll just have an impact on the world that I'm building. And I like that a lot more, although I haven't died yet. But if you can get that difficulty up, if you can give me a game that really challenges me and makes me feel like every game is something that I could have lost, then this will be a fantastic experience as opposed to the very, very good one it is currently. For right now, I'm giving this one a 4 out of 5, although it is tentative, very heavily based on how that difficulty goes in the final game. I can see this rising very easily if they manage to give me all the fun and the enjoyment of the experience as it currently is, but with that additional level of it feeling like more of a threat the entire way through. As far as game recommendations, other games to try out, I highly recommend Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion as far as being another dungeon crawler that gives you an accessible dive into the dungeon crawling world with the obvious, IP or gameplay of Gloomhaven. And then additionally, Agamonia. Agamonia, which is a game that you probably can't late back right now, but eventually sometime in the future you can get your hands on it. Agamonia is another accessible game that simultaneously blends beauty and accessibility and strategy all in a single package, the same way Tidal Blades has for me so far. In any case, I am Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you found this helpful, and as always, have a good one.